Under the cold, silvery glow of a late London evening, Buckingham Palace loomed against the night sky like a silent sentinel. Its grand facade, bathed in a mixture of tradition and mystery, seemed to carry the weight of centuries of monarchy. But behind its ancient stone walls, away from the cameras and ceremonial gates, a different kind of tension gripped the royal household, an urgency that not even the most seasoned courtiers could disguise. For days, whispers had been slipping through the palace corridors, whispers that carried the weight of dread. And now, those whispers had reached their loudest echo in the private quarters of Princess and in Prince William. The news was not a vague rumor. It was not the half-truth of a tabloid splash. It was cold, clinical, and unyielding. King Charles had only days left, not to abdicate, not to travel, not to recover, but to live. It was a truth so stark, so devastating, that even for two royals born and bred into the art of composure, it felt like a blow to the chest. The gravity of the revelation was almost unbearable. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But here is the most piercing part. This was not the kind of story you could delay. This was not the type of news you could bury under layers of PR strategy and ceremonial smiles. For Anne and William, the knowledge was an unrelenting clock ticking in the back of their minds, each second pressing down harder, urging decisions no family should have to make. Do they shield the king from the public eye and give him his final moments in peace? Or do they prepare the nation for an inevitable transition that will redefine the monarchy? Imagine, for a moment, what it must have felt like in that moment for William, the man destined to inherit the crown. To hear that his father's time was not counted in months or even weeks, but in single-digit days. And then imagine Anne, the steadfast sister, the one who had always carried her brother's burdens quietly, realizing that her role in this moment was not just as a sister, but as a custodian of the monarchy's stability. This was not about private grief alone. It was about the future of the institution itself. In the hours after the news reached them, palace life continued for the public eye. Guards in scarlet uniforms changed shifts, tourists took photos through the gates, and the royal social media accounts posted cheerful updates. But inside, the atmosphere had changed. The familiar click of polished shoes on the marble floors seemed slower, conversations in the hallways dropped to murmurs, and eyes darted toward closed doors more often than usual. The unspoken truth lingered in the air like a shadow. The king was fading. And yet, nothing was simple. The medical team's report, delivered in the privacy of the king's study, did not just detail his physical condition. It carried with it a brutal prediction. Few days. That phrase haunted Anne's mind. Few days. It was precise and ambiguous all at once. Was it 3? Was it 5? Could it be less? The doctors spoke in careful terms, knowing the weight of each word, but the reality was clear. There was no miracle to hope for now. The first person Anne called after she left that meeting was William. He wasn't in the palace at the time. He was at Windsor, tending to a scheduled engagement that suddenly seemed meaningless. His voice, when he picked up, was steady at first, but Anne could hear the quiet fracture in it as she told him. There was a pause on the line, longer than any pause she could remember between them. When William finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper. How long? Her answer, though exact in tone, was a dagger. William arrived at Buckingham later that evening. He walked in quickly, but not hurriedly. The weight of his role meant even urgency had to be controlled. He was shown to Anne's private sitting room, where she was already waiting with 2 cups of untouched tea between them. There was no small talk. There was no attempt to lighten the moment. The conversation began and ended with the reality they were both trying to process: how to handle the final days of their father's reign and his life. The middle of that night, the palace was quieter than usual, yet heavy with unspoken activity. Senior aides and advisors met in side rooms, debating contingency plans. The communications team drafted multiple versions of statements that might be needed, depending on whether the news leaked or was announced formally. Legal advisors reviewed protocols for transition, while security tightened in preparation for the inevitable media frenzy. The machine of the monarchy was already moving, even as the man at its center lay upstairs, fighting against the irreversible. And, ever pragmatic, spoke openly about the timeline they were facing. She was not one for wishful thinking. Her years of royal duty had trained her to look facts in the eye. William, however, found himself torn between the son who wanted to spend every private moment with his father and the heir who had to prepare himself and the nation for a monumental change. They debated long into the early hours, weighing the impact of telling the public too soon against the danger of being seen as withholding vital information. In their world, perception was as critical as reality. In the middle of these discussions, both of them knew one more complication hung over everything: Prince Harry. Contacting him was necessary, but the relationship between the brothers had grown so strained that even urgent news might be met with suspicion or cold formality. Would Harry rush back to England? Would he demand to be involved in decisions? Or would this be another wedge in an already fractured family dynamic? The questions were endless, and time was short. For now, and William agreed on one thing: they would stand united in public. Whatever personal disagreements, private fears, or political calculations existed between them, the nation could not see division in this moment. If the monarchy was to weather the storm of losing a king so suddenly, it needed to project strength, unity, and certainty. Even if that unity was partly constructed for the cameras, it had to hold. But unity did not erase the personal grief they felt. That night, as they left the strategy table and walked separately to their quarters, each carried the same image: their father as they had known him in their childhood, strong, decisive, confident. The thought that this man, who had once seemed larger than life, could be gone within days, was almost impossible to reconcile with the man they would see in the morning, a man whose steps were slower, whose voice was softer, whose strength was quietly slipping away. And so the stage was set for the days ahead, a stage where every gesture, every statement, every public appearance would be scrutinized, a stage where private sorrow had to be managed alongside public expectation. The king's final days were not just a family's intimate farewell. They were a national event, a constitutional moment, and a historical turning point. The truth was out between them now, and the clock had begun to tick. The day the whispers began inside Buckingham Palace was not marked by any grand announcement or visible change to the daily rhythm. On the surface, the palace functioned like a perfectly tuned orchestra. The royal guards performed their precision routines, tourists craned their necks to glimpse the royal balcony, and staff bustled in and out of service corridors with silver trays and polished documents. Yet, for those who had lived within its walls long enough, there was a different kind of sound that drifted through the corridors, a subdued tone to conversations, a quiet urgency in footsteps, and an unusual avoidance of eye contact among certain senior aides. It began in the royal household's inner office, where only the most trusted members of the king's personal staff worked. One of the king's private secretaries had been summoned to a meeting with his medical team, an unusual occurrence given the routine checkups that were normally kept low profile. The meeting was brief, the expressions afterward were pale, and the secretary left without a word. That alone was enough to raise eyebrows. In the palace, silence often spoke louder than words, and this silence felt heavy, deliberate. The first to pick up on it was a veteran palace aide, someone who had served through decades of royal transitions and family crises. She noticed the subtle changes, the king's schedule being quietly adjusted, engagements postponed with vague explanations, and a sudden increase in visits from his personal physician. Medical files were discreetly delivered to his study, and certain corridors were closed off entirely to limit public view of his movements. To the untrained eye, these were administrative coincidences. To her, they were signs. It was during one of these days of quiet tension that Princess Anne happened to be walking through the Queen's gallery after concluding a meeting on behalf of a charity. She was approached by a mid-level staffer she had known for years. His attempt at casual conversation faltered, his hands fidgeted, and in an uncharacteristic slip, he referred to the king's condition as if she already knew, and stopped walking. The words hung between them for a beat before he mumbled something about being late for another task and disappeared down the hall, and did not confront him immediately. Instead, she made her way to her own private sitting room, her mind turning over the possibility of what those words could mean. Charles had always been robust, at least in her eyes. While age had softened his frame and slowed his pace, he still carried himself with the presence of a monarch, disciplined posture, sharp eyes, and a certain measured authority that reassured everyone around him. But lately, she had noticed small things. The way he sometimes sat a little longer before standing, the pauses in conversation where he seemed to lose his train of thought, the almost imperceptible grimace when shaking hands for too long. Her instincts told her this was more than fatigue, and, practical and direct by nature, decided not to waste time with speculation. She sent a discreet message to one of the king's senior aides requesting an immediate private audience with him. It was granted, but not before she was told that the king was resting and might need to delay. She insisted. Within hours, she was walking the long carpeted hall toward his private quarters, each step echoing the weight of what she might learn. Inside, the king was seated by the window, his eyes fixed on the gardens beyond. There was a stillness to him that was both peaceful and unsettling. He greeted her warmly, but she noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he reached for his teacup. After a few moments of polite conversation and cut through the courtesies, she had no patience for platitudes, especially not now. "Charles," she said evenly, "what is going on?" There was a pause, a deep, lingering pause that made the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel feel deafening. Charles did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the door and motioned for one of his aides to step inside. The aide handed him a thin folder, its contents carefully clipped together. He pushed it across the table toward and without a word, and opened the folder and read. The medical language was precise and merciless. It described a condition that had been progressing for months, one that had recently taken a sharp turn for the worse. The most damning detail was near the end. Prognosis: limited days remaining, deterioration imminent. Anne's breath caught, but she forced herself to keep reading, as if the act of fully absorbing the words would somehow give her control over them. When she closed the folder, she looked up at her brother. His expression was calm, almost resigned. "They think it's a matter of days," he said quietly. There was no trace of self-pity, only the acceptance of a man who had carried heavy burdens all his life and now faced the final one. "I didn't want to tell you until I was certain," and felt the weight of that certainty press down on her. It wasn't only the personal loss she was facing. It was the understanding that the monarchy itself was about to shift under her feet. She thought of William, of the role he would soon inherit, of the pressure that would come with it. She thought of the nation, unprepared for such sudden news. And she thought of the palace itself, with all its centuries of history, about to witness the end of another reign. Leaving her brother's quarters, and knew there was no time to waste. She needed to speak with William, to prepare him for what was coming, and to decide on the next steps before the rumors spiraled into chaos. The first whispers had now become a harsh, undeniable truth. The only question left was how long they could keep it contained before the outside world heard the ticking clock too, and had never been one to shy away from hard truths. In her life, she had faced the media's relentless glare, political storms that threatened the monarchy's stability, and personal heartbreaks that could have broken someone with less resolve. But this was different. This was her brother, not as a sovereign, not as a public figure, but as the boy she had grown up with, the man who had stood beside her through decades of royal duty. And now, the knowledge that his life was slipping away in mere days was a weight she could not carry silently. She knew William had to be told immediately, but telling him meant more than sharing information. It meant shattering whatever fragile peace he had left before the storm. She placed the call herself, bypassing the formal channels. It was late in the evening, and she knew he was at Windsor, spending time with Catherine and the children. She could hear faint laughter in the background when he answered, the sound of a normal family evening. That made what she was about to say even harder. "William," she began, her voice steady but low, "I need you to come to Buckingham tonight. It's urgent." There was a pause. He knew her well enough to recognize that, and did not call something urgent unless it truly was. He asked no further questions, just said, "I'll be there." 2 hours later, William arrived. The drive from Windsor to London had been quiet, his mind running through a dozen scenarios, none of them quite matching the unease he felt in his stomach. When he entered the palace, he was met by a subdued aide who escorted him directly to Anne's private sitting room. She was already there, standing by the fireplace, her posture straight, but her eyes shadowed with worry. She didn't greet him with the usual small talk or even a warm embrace. Instead, she gestured for him to sit and handed him the same folder Charles had given her earlier that day. William opened it, and his face shifted almost immediately. A tightening of the jaw, a sharp inhale, and then a stillness that seemed to root him to the chair. He read every line, his eyes scanning back over certain paragraphs, as if hoping to find a different conclusion hidden in the words. When he finally closed the folder, the room was silent. He set it down carefully on the table between them, his fingers resting on it for a moment longer than necessary. "Few days?" he asked, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it, and nodded. "That's what the doctors said. They've been tracking his decline for months. It accelerated last week." William leaned back in his chair, his gaze unfocused. He was trying to process the information not just as a son, but as the future king. The dual roles warred within him, grief and duty pulling in opposite directions. "Does the public know anything?" he asked finally, and shook her head. "No, but they will, and we need to decide how and when." That was the heart of their conversation for the next hour. They spoke in clipped, deliberate sentences, weighing every possibility. If they told the public now, the nation would have time to prepare, but it would also bring an avalanche of media pressure on the king's final days. If they waited, the news might leak, and they'd lose control of the narrative entirely. Neither option was without risk, and, ever pragmatic, argued for a controlled announcement within 48 hours. William hesitated, his mind on his father's privacy and dignity. "He's still the king," he said. "We can't strip him of the right to choose how this ends for him." And reminded him that once the story broke outside the palace walls, they would have no power over how it was told. "Better it comes from us," she said firmly, "than from someone with half the facts and a taste for drama." At one point, William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened courtyard below. The weight of inheritance pressed heavily on him. He had always known this day would come, someday, but not like this, not with days to prepare instead of years. He thought of Catherine, of how he would explain this to the children, and of the moment he would have to step into his father's shoes while the grief was still raw, and watched him quietly. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but also the steel beneath it. He was his father's son in more ways than one, measured, deliberate, unwilling to rush into decisions without full consideration. But this was not a situation that would allow for the luxury of time. Eventually, the conversation circled back to Charles himself. They both agreed that he needed to be part of the decision, even if it meant having one of the hardest conversations of their lives. "He knows," and said, "but I don't think he's thought about how to tell the nation. He's been focused on making peace with it himself." William nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow, we speak to him together. We can't afford any more delay." By the time William left the palace that night, the clock in the grand hallway was striking midnight. The air outside was cold, the streets quiet, but the weight he carried back to Windsor was immense. For Anne, watching him leave, there was no relief in having shared the burden. If anything, it felt heavier now. They had moved from knowing the truth to planning what to do with it, and that was a responsibility neither of them could escape. The confrontation was not over. The real one, the one with their father, was still to come. And in the back of Anne's mind, she knew that when they sat down with Charles the next day, it would mark the beginning of the end. The morning after their late-night meeting, William arrived at Buckingham Palace earlier than he had in months. The air was crisp, a pale London sun cutting through thin clouds, casting light that seemed too gentle for the gravity of the day. He stepped out of the black Range Rover with a steady, deliberate pace, flanked only by his close protection officers. No press had caught wind of his arrival, at least, not yet. That in itself was a fragile blessing, and was already waiting in the king's private anteroom. She had not slept much, if at all. Her sharp eyes were ringed with fatigue, but her posture was as straight as ever. In her hands was the same thin medical folder they had both studied the night before. She didn't need it anymore. Every word of its contents was etched into her memory, but holding it felt like holding the truth itself. The two of them spoke little before being ushered into Charles's private study. It was a room William had known since childhood. Warm mahogany shelves stacked with old volumes, the faint scent of leather and tea leaves, and the soft ticking of a long-case clock that had marked countless moments of royal history. But today, the atmosphere felt different. The ticking was louder, the air heavier. Charles was seated behind his desk, wearing a light gray suit, the sort he favored for days when he wanted to appear relaxed but still authoritative. His expression brightened slightly at the sight of them, though William could see that the smile did not quite reach his eyes. There was a hollowness there, one that even the king's disciplined composure could not hide. "William," he said warmly, rising to greet his son. And his voice carried its usual depth, but it was softer than usual, almost as if each word required a touch more effort. They exchanged the customary courtesies, but it was clear none of them intended to waste time. And, ever the direct one, began. "We've read the report," she said, placing the folder gently on his desk. "And we need to talk about what comes next." Charles glanced at the folder, then back at her. "I see." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "And you've decided this conversation can't wait." William spoke then, his tone carefully measured. "Father, the nation doesn't know. But they will. You know how these things work. The smallest leak, and it'll be everywhere before we've had the chance to speak on it ourselves." Charles's gaze shifted to the window for a moment, as though he were weighing his response against the view of the gardens outside. "I had hoped," he began slowly, "to spare the public the spectacle until the end." His words trailed off, and the quiet that followed was thick with unspoken meaning. Anne's voice softened, but her resolve did not falter. "You can't control the end, Charles, but you can control how it begins. If we wait until the story breaks without us, it will be chaos." The king exhaled, his hands lowering to the desk. "I understand the need for preparation, but I also have a duty to fulfill while I still can." His eyes moved to William. "You will be taking on more than you imagine, and sooner than either of us expected." Those words landed like stones in William's chest. He had always known that the role would be his one day, but he had pictured that day as distant, years, perhaps even a decade away. The reality that it could be days away forced a shift in his thinking that felt almost violent. The conversation that followed was a careful dance between three perspectives. The father who wished to remain in control of his final days, the son who had to prepare for an abrupt ascension, and the sister who was determined to protect both family and institution. They discussed the logistics. How the palace would prepare a statement, how engagements would be handled, how the Privy Council would be informed. They also touched on the personal, who in the family needed to be told first, and how to navigate Harry's inevitable reaction. It was William who raised Harry's name. "We have to tell him," he said, though his voice carried the weight of years of strained communication. "If he hears it from the press, it will create another fracture we don't need right now." Charles nodded, but his expression was unreadable. "Do it sooner rather than later," he said simply, "and keep it private." And, sensing the conversation was drifting into the realm of palace politics, steered it back to the immediate concern. "So we agree? A statement in 2 days? Controlled, from us, on our terms." She looked between her brother and her nephew. Charles hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. 2 days. With that, the meeting began to wind down, though the heaviness in the room remained. Charles reached for his tea, his hand steady but slow. "I want to make one more public appearance," he said suddenly. "Something meaningful." Before the announcement, his tone left no room for debate, and both Anne and William knew they would need to honor that wish. When they left the study, the palace corridors felt narrower, the air cooler. William walked beside Anne in silence for a time before speaking. "It feels like the walls are closing in," he admitted quietly, and didn't respond right away. She knew exactly what he meant. There was no stopping the days from slipping away now. That afternoon, William canceled all but his most pressing engagements. He returned to Windsor with the folder in his briefcase, the weight of it heavier than any crown. The transition from son to heir apparent was no longer gradual. It was immediate, pressing, and irreversible. And, meanwhile, began quietly coordinating with senior aides to prepare for the coming days. Every move had to be planned, every word measured. Because when the announcement came, there would be no room for error. The entire country, and the world, would be watching. The phrase "few days" is deceptively simple. It looks harmless on paper, but when it's handed to you by a medical team discussing the fate of a reigning monarch, your father, it takes on an entirely different weight. Few days means a countdown you cannot stop, a clock that ticks no matter how much you plead for time. It means every minute becomes an uninvited negotiation between the past you're leaving behind and the future that's rushing toward you. For Anne and William, that phrase became both a warning and a command. After the meeting in Charles's study, they found themselves walking together through the palace's lesser-used east wing, away from the main corridors where courtiers and aides might overhear. The muted light filtering through the tall windows gave the space an almost unreal stillness, as though the palace itself understood the gravity of their discussion. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, both still processing the confirmation they had just received from the king himself. It was, and who broke the silence. We're not talking about weeks. We're talking about days. We have to accept that. She spoke with the same bluntness she had used on William the night before, but now it carried a sharper edge. There was no room left for hope disguised as denial. William nodded, though his eyes were fixed on the floor. I know, but knowing it and living it are two very different things. His voice was steady, but she could hear the strain underneath. How many days do you think he actually has? Anne's mouth tightened. No more than a handful. If he has a good morning tomorrow, it won't mean anything in the long run. The doctors were clear. Once the final decline starts, it's quick. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Which means every choice we make from this point has to be deliberate. We won't get a second chance. They both understood the implications, the timing of the announcement, the king's final engagements, the careful handling of the Privy Council, and perhaps most delicate of all, the conversation with Harry. These were decisions that would be remembered for decades, dissected by historians, and, more immediately, picked apart by the press. And reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a rough draft she had written in the early hours of the morning, a list of tasks, conversations, and decisions that needed to be made before the end. This is what has to happen before the announcement, she said, handing it to him. William unfolded it and read through quickly. Inform immediate family. Prepare a controlled public statement. Consult with the Archbishop of Canterbury on the ceremonial aspects. Brief key government figures, and coordinate security for the king's last appearance. 2 days, William murmured, echoing the deadline they had agreed upon with Charles. That's not long enough. It has to be, and replied firmly. Any longer, and the press will get to it first. We'll lose the narrative, and once that happens, we can't take it back. The phrase losing the narrative was something William had heard countless times in his life, but now it carried an almost tangible threat. He imagined the chaos of a leak, tabloids printing half-truths, reporters swarming outside every royal residence, wild speculation filling social media feeds. It would be a circus, and the dignity of his father's final days would be trampled in the frenzy. They reached Anne's private office, a smaller, more functional room than the ornate spaces most imagined when they thought of royalty. Closing the door behind them, she motioned for him to sit. We need to plan this like a military operation, she said, pulling out a large calendar and laying it on the desk. She drew a red circle around 2 days from now. This is the announcement. Everything else works backward from here. They mapped it out in silence at first. Today would be dedicated to preparing the king's schedule, ensuring he had the strength for the final appearance he'd requested. Tomorrow would be for private family time, though in the palace, even that required careful planning to avoid prying eyes. The morning of the announcement would be reserved for briefing the Prime Minister and Privy Council, followed by the public statement. But as they spoke, William kept glancing at the clock on the wall. It was not the announcement date that haunted him. It was the knowledge that the king might not make it to that date at all. What if he takes a turn before then? He asked suddenly. What if he can't stand or speak? Or he trailed off, unable to say the word in the space between them. Anne's eyes softened, but her tone remained practical. Then we adjust. If we have to move the announcement forward, we will. But we prepare as if we have the time. By midday, they had the framework of a plan. Trusted aides would begin quietly alerting certain departments without revealing the full reason. Phrases like contingency planning and transition protocol would be used, terms that meant everything and nothing at the same time. The royal communications team would work in absolute secrecy, their drafts written in secure rooms with no digital traces until the moment they were needed. One of the most delicate points on their agenda was the matter of the king's final engagement. Charles had made it clear he wanted something meaningful, something that spoke to his life's work rather than a ceremonial obligation. The challenge was finding an event that could be arranged on such short notice without drawing suspicion. They settled on the idea of a small gathering with environmental leaders at Clarence House, a cause that had defined much of his public service. It could be framed as a private meeting, which would allow them to control the optics. As the afternoon light shifted and lengthened across the palace courtyard, the two of them worked through every detail they could think of, knowing that no plan could account for every variable. And all the while, the unspoken deadline loomed over them, a silent, relentless presence in the room. By the time they concluded, the palace outside had resumed its usual rhythm, the sounds of daily life almost mocking in their normalcy. But inside Anne's office, the air still felt taut, charged with the knowledge that the countdown had already begun. When William left that evening, he carried more than just a plan. He carried the knowledge that every step they took from here would be scrutinized for decades, and that somewhere in the palace, his father's clock was ticking down to its final chime. Harry's absence was not just a physical void. It was a wound in the family structure that had been slowly festering for years. The reality of it became painfully clear the moment Anne and William sat down to discuss the next steps in informing immediate family members about Charles's condition. Normally, such a task would be straightforward, an uncomfortable call, perhaps, but one cushioned by the understanding that family came before protocol in moments like these. But with Harry, nothing was straightforward anymore. The rift between him and the rest of the royal family had turned into a chasm since he and Meghan's departure to the United States. Public interviews, accusations, and the slow erosion of trust had left every conversation laced with suspicion. Still, there was no question in Anne's mind that he had to be told directly, and soon. As much as she disliked the idea of dealing with the emotional volatility that often came with these exchanges, she understood that hearing the news from anyone but them would only deepen the divide. They met in one of the smaller meeting rooms in the palace, neutral ground where business could be conducted without the distractions of grandeur. William was already seated when Anne walked in, a phone resting on the table in front of him. He looked like a man bracing for impact. "Are we calling him together?" William asked without looking up. "Yes," Anne replied. "It's better coming from both of us. He'll have fewer reasons to think one of us is trying to spin it." There was a beat of silence before William reached for the phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number that, despite everything, he had never removed. Pressing the call button, he put it on speaker, and they waited. The ringing seemed to stretch longer than usual, each tone pressing against the air in the room. When Harry finally answered, his voice was cautious. "William, it's me. Anne's here too." A pause. "This must be serious." William wasted no time. "It is. We've just come from seeing Father. The doctors have given us a prognosis. It's not good. They're saying days." The line was quiet. Too quiet. For a moment, William thought the call had dropped, but then Harry's voice came back, low and tight. "Days? You're telling me this now?" And stepped in, her tone measured but firm. "We're telling you as soon as we had confirmation from him directly. This isn't speculation, Harry. It's reality. We need you to decide how you're going to handle this, whether you're coming back to see him or not." Harry exhaled sharply. "You know it's not that simple. If I come, the media will turn it into a circus. If I don't, they'll say I abandoned him. Either way, I lose." "This isn't about the media," William said, his voice hardening. "This is about saying goodbye to your father while you still can." There was another long pause, and then Harry's tone shifted, colder, more guarded. "And Meghan? Where does she fit into this?" And William exchanged a glance. It was the question they'd been expecting, though it still made the conversation more complicated. "This isn't about her," Anne replied. "It's about you and your father. Come alone if you need to, but come soon." Harry didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were clipped. "I'll think about it." The call ended there. No promises, no goodbyes, just the hollow click of a disconnected line. William leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "He's not coming." Anne's expression was unreadable. "If he doesn't, that's on him. We've done our duty." She stood, gathering the folder of notes from their planning session. "But be ready for him to speak publicly about it anyway. If he feels cut out, he'll tell his side before we can tell ours." That was the unspoken danger in all of this. With the relationship as fractured as it was, Harry's absence could easily become a headline of its own, distracting from the gravity of the king's condition. Worse, his narrative could conflict with the official palace account, turning the story into a tug-of-war between fact and perception. Later that evening, William sat alone in his study at Windsor, the call replaying in his head. He knew Harry well enough to recognize that his brother's hesitation was as much about pride as it was about logistics. But pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Each passing hour brought them closer to the point of no return. At Buckingham, Anne was equally restless. She had expected Harry's response, but it still irritated her. In moments like this, she felt the gap between her father's generation and theirs. Charles would have handled such family matters with quiet firmness, demanding unity no matter the personal cost. Now, unity was something they could only hope for, not command. The next morning brought no word from Harry, confirming Anne's suspicion that he was wrestling with the decision, or avoiding it entirely. In the meantime, the work continued. The deadline loomed, and the king's health did not pause for family drama. By midday, it was clear they would have to proceed as though Harry would not be present. That meant adjusting security protocols, altering the seating for private family gatherings, and preparing responses to inevitable media questions about his absence. Every adjustment felt like a quiet acknowledgement that the family would not be whole in the king's final days. And William did not speak of it again that day. There were too many other details to handle, too many moments that demanded their focus. But the absence hung there, unspoken yet undeniable, a shadow on every plan they made. The call to the Prime Minister was not made lightly. In the hierarchy of events that demanded immediate government attention, the failing health of a reigning monarch ranked among the most sensitive and consequential. By long-established constitutional tradition, the Prime Minister is not only kept informed of the sovereign's health, but is also expected to prepare for the smooth transition of power if the end is near. For this reason, the conversation between the royal household and Downing Street was conducted with utmost secrecy, shielded from even the most experienced political journalists who made a career out of sniffing out whispers from behind closed doors. It was shortly after 9 in the evening when Anne and William, seated together in a private meeting room at Buckingham, agreed that the call could no longer wait. Charles's condition had remained fragile throughout the day. Though he'd been able to complete a short briefing with his aides that morning, by afternoon he was visibly drained, his energy slipping like sand through fingers. The two senior royals knew they could not gamble on the assumption that he would still be strong enough to handle state matters in a few days' time. The Prime Minister needed to hear the truth now. The task fell to William. His voice carried the blend of courtesy and authority that the situation required when he reached the PM's private line. The exchange began with formal pleasantries, but William quickly steered it toward the matter at hand. "Prime Minister, I'm calling with news of the king's health," he said, his tone grave but controlled. "We have had confirmation from his medical team that the situation is critical. The prognosis is days, not weeks." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by the PM's measured reply. "I see. I'm very sorry to hear that." But beneath the words was an unmistakable shift, a readiness to move into crisis management mode. "I assume you're preparing for the announcement." "We are," William confirmed. "The intention is to make a controlled statement within 48 hours, provided he is still with us. But I felt it imperative that you be informed tonight. There will be constitutional implications to manage, and I want no surprises for the government when the moment comes." The Prime Minister asked several pointed questions. Was the king still lucid enough to sign necessary documents? Had the Privy Council been briefed? What was the plan for ensuring continuity if the king became unable to perform his duties even in these final days? William answered each question with the clarity that came from hours of preparation with Anne. The plan, though fragile in the face of illness, was in place. After ending the call, William relayed the details to Anne, who had been watching his face closely for signs of how the conversation was unfolding. She nodded once. "Good. The fewer people we catch off guard, the better. But he'll want a face-to-face before the announcement." And was right. The Prime Minister was a cautious man, but also one who understood the optics of leadership. If the public learned he had been briefed only by phone, it could be construed as a sign of instability or disorganization. A personal meeting would show unity between crown and government, even in the midst of crisis. And so, the arrangements were quietly made. By late that night, a small convoy of unmarked vehicles was on its way to the palace. The motorcade was discreet, its passage unnoticed by the public except for a few pedestrians who happened to glance up from their phones. The cars entered through a side gate rarely used except for moments like this, moments that history books would later record in tidy, understated sentences, even if they had been fraught with tension in real time. Inside the palace, the Prime Minister was met not by Charles himself, who had retired to his private rooms, but by and William. The meeting took place in the king's private council chamber, a solemn, wood-paneled room that seemed to absorb the gravity of every word spoken within it, and began with a formal acknowledgement. Prime Minister, thank you for coming on such short notice. You understand the sensitivity of the information we are about to share. The PM inclined his head. I do. William then walked him through the timeline, from the king's diagnosis to the recent deterioration, and finally to the medical team's prognosis, and added details about the preparations already underway, from the drafting of the announcement to the plans for Charles's final public engagement. The Prime Minister listened carefully, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. When they finished, he spoke slowly. You have my full cooperation. We will ensure that the machinery of government is ready to act when the time comes. But I must ask, do you believe there will be any complications within the family that could affect public perception of the transition? It was a diplomatic way of asking about Harry. William's answer was equally diplomatic. We've informed all immediate family members. Some decisions about their participation will be personal. He offered nothing more, and the Prime Minister wisely did not press the point. The conversation then turned to the ceremonial and constitutional logistics that would follow the king's passing. The Prime Minister assured them that contingency speeches had already been prepared, as was customary. Plans for the accession council were in place, and the Cabinet Office was on alert. When the meeting concluded, the Prime Minister expressed his personal condolences, adding a remark that struck both and William as unusually candid. Whatever disagreements there may have been, he has been a steadying figure for the nation. That will be felt when he's gone. As the motorcade slipped away into the London night, and William walked together back through the dimly lit corridors. The meeting had gone as well as they could have hoped, but it had also marked another irreversible step toward the end. The government was now officially preparing for life after Charles. The knowledge settled on them like the chill of the early morning air that was beginning to seep through the palace windows, and broke the silence first. We've moved from days to hours, William. We may not get the luxury of our timeline. William glanced at her, his face shadowed by the thought. Then we'll have to be ready sooner. Every second counts now. The following morning brought a clear sky, the kind of crisp blue London seldom offers in winter. The sunlight flooded into Buckingham Palace's south-facing rooms, bouncing off the polished floors and gilded frames, creating the illusion of warmth. But inside the palace walls, the atmosphere was anything but light. Every shaft of sunlight only seemed to throw the reality into sharper relief. King Charles had only a handful of days left, and the nation was still in the dark. The public saw what the palace allowed them to see. That morning, the Royal Press Office released carefully chosen images of the king attending a brief private audience with a visiting ambassador. He was dressed impeccably in a dark navy suit, a faint smile fixed on his lips, and his handshake steady enough to fool most casual observers. The photographs were taken from just the right angles that masked the pallor in his skin and the slight slump in his shoulders. But to those in the room, the performance was harder to watch. And stood at the back, watching her brother marshal the same composure he had displayed in countless engagements before, yet she could see the cracks. His pauses between sentences were just a beat too long. The smile lingered a fraction of a second after the conversation had moved on, and when the ambassador departed, the king's hand dropped to his side with a heaviness that betrayed the toll such brief appearances now took on him. William joined her after the ambassador left. He's pushing himself too hard, he said under his breath. And's eyes stayed fixed on Charles. He needs to. He knows what's coming, and he doesn't want the last image people have of him to be weakness. It was a calculated decision on the king's part, to maintain an image of strength and stability for as long as possible, even if it meant burning through what little energy he had left. But it came at a cost. By the afternoon, The king was confined to his private quarters, his doctor advising rest after what was, in truth, a 15-minute meeting. That same day, the communications team met with and in William in a small side office, walls lined with decades of framed royal portraits. The discussion was direct: how to balance the king's public image with the truth of his condition. The head of communications suggested increasing the frequency of public photos and short video clips, all controlled, to reassure the public until the official announcement was ready, and rejected the idea outright. "We can't create a facade so convincing that the truth feels like a betrayal when it comes," she said. "There's a fine line between protecting his dignity and misleading the nation." William agreed, though for different reasons. "If he collapses or shows visible distress during one of these appearances, we lose control of the story entirely. One video clip on social media, and our timeline is irrelevant." Still, the king insisted on one more public outing, a walk outside the palace gates to greet well-wishers. Word was quietly spread through unofficial channels, ensuring a modest crowd would gather without attracting overwhelming media attention. On the day of the walk, the crisp air carried a certain tension, though the crowd itself was cheerful. They waved flags and called out messages of support, unaware of the storm brewing behind palace walls. Charles moved along the small crowd with deliberate care, shaking hands, exchanging a few words here and there. To the untrained eye, he seemed composed, even spirited at moments. But those closest to him noticed the signs: the way his left hand lingered on the edge of the barrier for balance, the subtle tightening of his jaw when a breeze cut sharply across the courtyard. A young woman in the crowd handed him a small bouquet of white roses. "For your Majesty's health," she said, smiling warmly. Charles accepted them with a gracious nod, his voice soft but sincere. "That's very kind of you." The moment was captured by a photographer and would later circulate widely online, hailed as a touching gesture. For Anne, who watched from a few feet away, it was bittersweet, proof that he could still inspire loyalty and affection, even as his strength faded. Behind the scenes, his private struggles became harder to disguise. He required longer rest periods, and the number of aides present during his movements quietly increased to ensure someone was always close enough to steady him if needed. His diet was adjusted to small, easily managed portions, and his meetings were shortened to avoid fatigue. These adjustments were kept from the public eye, but for those inside the palace, they were a daily reminder that the king's days were numbered. Late one evening, after the walkabout, William found himself sitting with his father in the king's study. The room was dim, lit only by a desk lamp and the faint glow from the fireplace. Charles was in his armchair, a plaid blanket draped over his knees. He looked tired, but there was an alertness in his gaze that told William the conversation was deliberate. "I wanted to thank you," Charles began, "for handling all of this with such care. It's not easy, I know." William hesitated before replying. "I'm not doing it for the crown. I'm doing it for you." Charles smiled faintly. They're the same thing, in the end. They spoke for nearly an hour, touching on matters both personal and constitutional. Charles offered quiet advice on leadership, much of it distilled from his own decades of preparation under the shadow of the throne. "You'll find the weight changes once it's yours," he said. "Even if you think you understand it now, it will be different." When William left the study that night, he felt the reality settle more heavily on his shoulders. These weren't just conversations between father and son anymore. They were briefings between monarch and heir, each word chosen with the knowledge that it might be the last on the subject. The following morning, a handful of journalists who specialized in royal coverage began to speculate about the king's health in vague, careful terms. No one claimed to have inside information, but the unusually short engagements, coupled with the palace's tightly controlled media output, had caught their attention. The whispers had not yet turned into headlines, but it was only a matter of time. And, reading the day's press clippings over breakfast, knew that the window for controlling the story was closing. She circled a paragraph in one of the papers, a single sentence about reduced public duties that seemed innocuous but could, in the wrong hands, ignite a firestorm. She folded the paper and set it aside. The countdown was no longer just inside the palace walls. It had begun in the outside world, too. Camilla had always been a figure of both public scrutiny and private complexity within the royal family. Her role as queen consort was as much about navigating delicate family dynamics as it was about ceremonial duties. Yet, in the shadow of King Charles's declining health, her position became even more precarious, a balancing act between personal grief and public expectation. When the news of Charles's prognosis became official within the palace, Camilla's initial reaction was one of quiet shock, though she quickly masked it beneath a veneer of composure. Those close to her described a woman who carried her burdens privately, often retreating to the quieter wings of Clarence's house to gather her strength away from prying eyes. But beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. One of the earliest signs of strain appeared during a private family meeting convened by and William to coordinate the announcement plans. Camilla arrived late, her usually poised demeanor tinged with exhaustion. The conversation was brisk, focusing on logistics and messaging, but it was clear that she was holding back strong emotions. At one point, Anne noticed her fingers clenching the edge of the chair tightly, an uncharacteristic display of frustration. Later, a trusted palace aide overheard a heated exchange between Camilla and just outside the meeting room. The conversation was hushed but intense. Camilla reportedly accused Anne of rushing the announcement and not considering the king's wishes. And, in turn, pushed back, emphasizing the need for transparency and the dangers of secrecy in such a critical moment. The argument, though brief, revealed fissures beneath the family's public unity. Camilla's concerns were not unfounded. She had always prioritized protecting Charles's privacy and dignity above all else. To her, the announcement felt like exposing a deeply personal and painful moment to a hungry public. She worried about the relentless media attention and feared that the focus on his failing health would overshadow his lifetime of achievements. Despite these tensions, Camilla remained committed to her duties. She spent long hours at the king's bedside, offering quiet companionship and support. Staff who witnessed these moments described her as a steady presence, often sitting silently, holding his hand or reading to him softly. These intimate moments contrasted sharply with the fiery debates she engaged in behind closed doors. The balance Camilla tried to maintain was delicate. On one hand, she was the queen consort, expected to uphold the monarchy's image and assist in the smooth transition of power. On the other, she was a wife grappling with impending loss, navigating a family that was fractured and under intense public scrutiny. Her role was both political and deeply personal, often pulling her in opposing directions. Publicly, Camilla continued to appear composed. She attended select engagements, though her appearances were brief and carefully managed. Her speeches subtly acknowledged the king's condition without drawing direct attention, emphasizing themes of resilience and unity. The media noted her unwavering dedication, with some outlets softening their previous criticisms in light of the unfolding situation. Yet behind the palace gates, the pressure mounted. Camilla's relationship with other family members, particularly Anne, was tested repeatedly. Private conversations sometimes escalated into disagreements over how best to honor Charles's wishes versus the practical necessities of public life. Staff recounted moments when Camilla retreated to her private quarters after such clashes, visibly shaken but determined to persevere. One of the most poignant moments came during a late-night meeting with William. Camilla confided her fears, not just about losing Charles, but about the legacy they were about to leave behind. She worried that the royal family's internal struggles would overshadow his reign and that the monarchy's future was more fragile than many realized. William, sharing his own anxieties, reassured her that they would face the coming challenges together, but both understood that the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. In the days that followed, Camilla's role became increasingly central. She worked closely with the palace communications team to craft messages that balanced honesty with hope, preparing the nation for the difficult news while preserving Charles's dignity. She also engaged with charities and causes dear to the king, ensuring that his legacy would be celebrated even as his health declined. Through it all, Camilla's personal resilience was tested. She faced public speculation about her influence and motivations, rumors that intensified as the king's condition worsened. Friends noted that she often relied on a small circle of trusted confidants for support, finding solace in their companionship away from the relentless spotlight. Despite the challenges, Camilla remained a pillar for the family. Her quiet strength provided a foundation amid the swirling uncertainty. She understood that in the coming days, every gesture, every word, and every appearance would carry immense weight. Not just for the family, but for a nation preparing to say goodbye to its sovereign. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace was heavier than ever as the family prepared for what many understood to be their final gathering with King Charles before the public announcement. It was a moment both deeply private and inevitably public, filled with unspoken emotions and guarded glances. The evening of the gathering was cold and clear, the kind of night when the air feels sharp enough to cut through even the thickest layers of decorum. Family members arrived in small groups, escorted quietly through back entrances to avoid the attention of the waiting press. Inside, the grand staterooms had been arranged to provide both comfort and intimacy, a delicate balance between a royal reception and a private farewell, and was among the first to arrive, her calm exterior masking the turmoil beneath. She moved through the rooms with practiced grace, greeting cousins, aunts, and longtime family friends with measured smiles. Yet even her composed manner faltered briefly when she caught sight of a photograph of her father displayed on a side table. The younger Charles, confident and vibrant, seemingly a lifetime away from the frailty he now faced. William arrived shortly after, accompanied by Catherine, who immediately sought to offer quiet support. The couple navigated the gathering with a subtle but determined purpose, to hold the family together, even as the foundations seemed to tremble beneath them. William's face was solemn, his eyes betraying the immense responsibility he was beginning to shoulder. As more family members trickled in, the weight of the occasion grew. Conversations were hushed, laughter rare and fleeting. The presence of King Charles was the invisible thread tying everyone together, a reminder of both their shared history and the uncertain future. Charles himself made his way into the room shortly after the last arrivals, assisted gently by Camilla. His movements were slower now, each step deliberate, the strength that once filled his presence replaced by a quiet dignity. His eyes scanned the faces of those gathered, lingering on William and with a warmth that transcended the sadness in the air. The king took his place in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, where the soft crackle of the flames seemed to fill the silence between words. One by one, family members approached, offering embraces, handshakes, and whispered words of affection. Some voices cracked under the weight of emotion. Others maintained their customary restraint. At one point, and stepped forward, taking her brother's hand with a firm but tender grip. "We're all here for you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. Charles nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, and it means more than you know." William followed, kneeling briefly to meet his father's gaze at eye level. "We'll carry on your legacy, father. The family, the nation, will be ready." Charles smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and sadness passing across his features. "I trust you will, more than anyone." The gathering moved on to a quiet dinner, where the conversation drifted between reminiscing about old times and tentative plans for the days ahead. Stories were shared, some lighthearted, others tinged with melancholy. The family clung to these moments, aware that soon, their roles and relationships would shift irrevocably. Throughout the evening, subtle tensions emerged beneath the surface. The absence of Prince Harry was keenly felt, his name mentioned only in hushed tones or avoided altogether. Discussions about media strategy and public messaging hinted at underlying disagreements, but a collective effort was made to keep the mood respectful and united. As the night wore on, Charles took a moment to speak to his grandchildren, his voice gentle but clear. He imparted words of encouragement and love, urging them to remember the importance of family and service. These private moments were a stark contrast to the public duties that had defined much of his life, revealing a man who, despite his regal responsibilities, treasured the bonds that truly defined him. The final hours of the gathering were spent in quiet reflection. Some family members sought solace in each other's company, while others retreated to private corners to grapple with their own feelings. And William shared a brief conversation away from the others, acknowledging the enormity of what lay ahead and reaffirming their commitment to face it together. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, the palace felt emptier, the echoes of laughter and conversation replaced by a profound stillness. The final family gathering was over, but its significance would resonate in the days to come, a poignant farewell wrapped in duty, love, and the shadow of loss.